Hello, and welcome to your second small group session. We're really glad that you are taking this journey with us, and we know that the more that you interact with each other and open yourselves up to God, the more rewarding it will be for all of us, yourself included. As we get started, just a reminder, we have agreed that this would be a shame-free zone. No shaming of each other, no shaming of ourselves. We will seek to let go of shame, be non-judgmental presence for each other, keep everything that we share in group confidential, and also that we will try to let go of that agree-disagree mentality, which means that instead of continuing to think about the content and what we can dismiss out of it because we don't want to interact with it, that we will try to imagine, what if this were so? What does it mean for me? And how might God be calling me to be changed? So instead of agreeing or disagreeing, thinking about, how does this relate with my life? Or how could God be calling me in the midst of it? As we get started, today our topic is looking beneath the surface. In your workbook, you'll see a picture of an iceberg. And as we look at our lives, we know that our lives are very much like an iceberg, aren't they? There's often just a little bit that's above the surface that we let everybody else see and that we fully know about ourselves. Then we see that there's a whole lot more that's under the surface, some of which we know about, but maybe we don't want other people to see. And then others of which that we know is there, but we may not be willing to face ourselves, and some of it that we don't even really know is there, but is still affecting us. There's a lot of our lives that remains uncovered, and Jesus invites us to look below the surface of our lives. Have you ever had where you saw a look on someone else's face and you made a meaning out of that later that you found out, oops, that wasn't the meaning you should have made? We all have that, don't we? See, what happens when we're interacting with each other oftentimes is that my iceberg below the surface is interacting with your iceberg below the surface. We may not even be realizing it, but it causes us to make meanings out of each other, to take things personal where they weren't meant to be personal, to be completely on a different plane of understanding, and oftentimes can cause a great amount of emotions to rise up that we may not even be aware of. This is one really important part about us looking beneath the surface of our own lives and being aware of what's going on in ourselves as we interact with each other and with God. Remember, we said that most Christians are more self-conscious than they are self-aware. We're often worried about looking good instead of realizing and taking who we are before God, being aware of ourselves, dealing with who we are, and asking God to help us in the midst of it. Our aim is to become more self-aware. During this session, you're going to get a chance to read the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. As we look at the story, we see that this woman came to the well in the middle of the day. Most likely, she was trying to avoid any sort of interaction with someone coming at the hottest time of the day when most likely no one else would be there. We see this, and then we see Jesus inviting her into the interaction about that stuff beneath the surface that maybe she tries to keep hidden from others. Yet, Jesus' way of inviting her to deal with it and inviting her into a more renewed life with God leaves her to, what does she do? She becomes, in some case in the Gospel of John, the first missionary. No longer does she avoid interacting with others, she runs out telling others of who this is. This wonder worker, come and see, who's told me everything I know, who promises me living water. She goes, and many believe because of her testimony. We see this as a beautiful way of our own willingness to look below the surface of our lives with God can too help us to get over some of these things that we're afraid of facing, to see instead that gospel-freeing message. As our author, Peter Scazzero, defines us becoming aware to look below the surface in 4 ways. The first way is a willingness to develop an awareness of what I am feeling and what I am doing. So paying attention to ourselves. Sometimes this just means paying attention to my own physical reactions. I know that sometimes when I'm in a meeting or a conversation of something that really excites me, I'll begin shaking. But for each one of us to become conscious of our own physical reactions to things. Sometimes it means pausing and thinking to ourselves, how do I feel about that? Sometimes we get so caught in our thought, depending on our personality, that we forget to recognize, how am I feeling? And really think about it and name it. And then sometimes as we name it, to bring that before God and ask God what God would think and what God would want us to do with those feelings. Sometimes it means stop trying to point and fix other people or to help other people and stop avoiding what's really going on with us. So developing awareness of what we are feeling and we are doing starts with me. Secondly, is to ask the why and the what's going on questions. So as I reflect on myself, why is it that I always fill in the blank? Why is it that I'm always late to that particular meeting? Or why is it that I really am avoiding that person? Or why is it that anytime this subject comes up, my anxiety just goes through the roof? Or why is it that this person brings out a sense of panic or any other reaction in me? So instead of taking it on that other person, realizing, what is it in me that responds this way? What's going on? Ask the why and the what's going on questions about ourselves. Number 3 is to get rid of what our author calls this glittering image. Sometimes we have this image that we're trying to be the best that we can be, that we're the Christians, we go to church, we whatever. I'm the pastor, I need to be good at everything. Whatever it is, to let that go. Sometimes we're afraid to look beneath the surface of our lives because we think, you wouldn't like me if you knew what were there. We need to get rid of that. We need to be honest that we come together as sinners. We come together humble before our gracious God, and we need to listen more to number 4, our author says, is to listen to God's promises to us in the Bible. And we know that just as surely as we hear that voice saying inside of us, well, if I look below the surface, I'm not going to like what I find, that God reminds us, I love you. I know you. I knit you together in your mother's womb. I know every thought you have, and I love you anyway. And in other places, God tells us, I came for you just as you are, right? And as we listen to all those promises that we know that God says, that can help us, give us the strength to look beneath the surface. As I mentioned before, what we really need are not more self-conscious Christians, but more self-aware Christians, aware of what's going on inside us, aware of the impact that we're having on other people, aware of what God is trying to stir within us, aware of our emotions, that we may be able to be better servants of God here and now, and to not be detracted by fear, by something that happened in our past, by whatever the emotional hold is over us, that God helps us to remain connected to each other and connected to God. I'm going to end with a quote from our author as he talks about going beneath the surface. He says, "In the past, I spent hours with God, beseeching God to accomplish my plans and my agenda ultimately. However, now I spend more time in the quiet place, alone with my feelings, wrestling with the why question in an open, contemplative way with God and listening to God. Richard Foster, in his best-selling book, A Celebration of Discipline, begins by noting, "The desperate need today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or gifted people, but for deep people." I am a 100% believer in spiritual disciplines. Their purpose for us is to love God and others well. That requires that we develop into emotionally healthy disciples who are aware and feel deeply, who ask appropriate why questions, and who are then reflective before God and others with this material. May you be encouraged to dare greatly in sharing your thoughts and emotions, that we might continue to journey together to being that authentic community that the author speaks about, that we might fulfill more of God's purposes for us.